Good afternoon, folks. It's been about 50 years since I started my career as a political scientist when I went to graduate school. And I went to Northwestern where I was trained more or less in quantitative methods. But in the process of teaching philosophy of social science classes, I began to become suspicious of the limitations of empiricist philosophy of social science. I began to work on the philosophy of language. Then I discovered the work on discourse, especially Michel Foucault's The Archaeology of Knowledge. And I started moving away from quantitative methods into more interpretive work. And ultimately, from the philosophy of language, I found myself getting fascinated by various kinds of genres: crime stories, films, literature, architecture, music. When I send something to a social science journal, the typical empiricist social scientist wants to know what the criteria are by which I've chosen the particular text that I analyze. And it's not a matter of sampling. Deleuze says somewhere that we encounter something in the world and suddenly it makes us think. And so the criteria basically are something that makes me think. So, for example, to go back to the essay, The Beautician by Thomas de Bozy, I read it and it made me think. But it made me think about the situation of the particular characters. And so typically what I will do is dwell in that place, as that place has been articulated by a whole variety of different cultural texts.
Est-ce que quelqu'un est venu m'attendre?
The beginning of thinking is based on an encounter of some sort. You're affected by something. Once you're affected by something, you begin to react to it. And once you finish reacting to it, then subsequently, after the affects have set in, you begin to develop concepts to begin to make sense of it, so that your sensual experience comes first and the conceptual experience comes afterwards. And I'm influenced to some extent by an interesting remark that the writer Stanley Elkin makes. If in one of his novels or stories there's a hotel room, he doesn't just fantasize about what a hotel room is like, he moves into one that's very similar to what he wants to talk about, right? And so it's a matter basically of creating an experiential trajectory that allows you to thicken the particular text that you begin with. Right? And so it always begins with one text, right? But then what I try to do is thicken that experience with a whole variety of others. And so that's the method, as it were.
Can I help you, gentlemen?
We're looking for someone called Chennai Gillick. Thought she might be working here.
Do you see anybody working here?
Once I begin to work on an essay, there are two kinds of genres, there are two kinds of texts that I turn to. I usually begin with a text that I use to develop the concepts that I want to work with, and then I use additional text to illustrate them. It's an essay kind of style. I don't try to explain things. I try to work by juxtaposition. What I'm saying and how I'm saying it is what constitutes the form of thinking that I'm trying to develop. And so frequently if I send something to a social science journal, the average social scientist gets confused. He's speaking about this thing over here and now he's speaking about something else. But it's the shift, it's the juxtaposition of one thing and another that articulates what it is that I'm trying to effect. Very much the way a director works with film. They speak, in effect, by editing. And so to understand my work, you have to think of me as an editor, not an explainer, as it were. Okay?
Znači, nećeš pušku.
Jebem i tebe, i pušku, i rat.
And so the question becomes, when I deal with literary or cinematic texts, what is the significance of the characters? And what's important to me is to recognize that these characters are not best understood as psychological subjects, but rather as aesthetic subjects. And by that I mean, it's not so much that I'm interested in finding out what it is internally that makes them express what they're doing, but rather how their movement in the world tells us what kind of world it is, the extent to which various forms of susceptibility to their movement, inhibitions, permissions, and so forth. And I learned a lot about that by paying attention, among other things, to the writing of Ralph Ellison, an African-American who began as a musician in Alabama, moved to New York to become a writer, and while in New York, he had to learn new thou shalt nots, as he put it, meaning that his ability to move in New York depended on a racial spatial order, which was racist as it was in Alabama, but it was racist in a different way. Different inhibitions, different encouragements, a different experience. And so Ralph Ellison becomes for me an aesthetic subject who tells us what New York is about as a racial spatial order.
La rue était vide. Juste passaient deux femmes. Elles étaient belles et je les regardais.
Everything here is connected to everything else.
Okay, I want to talk about an aspect of my personal life that was responsible for my becoming interested in politics and political science. I didn't realize it when I was quite young, but I grew up in a racist household. My family would eat in the dining room, and an African-American servant would eat in the kitchen while we were there. And at first, my impression was that the distinction, the division was between the household and the employee. But then my sister was born when I was 10 years old, and another servant moved into the household briefly, a very pink and white lady from Nova Scotia named Nanny Moore. And so I waited patiently to see what would happen the first evening, and sure enough, there was Nanny Moore eating in the dining room with us. And I said to myself, holy shit, it's race. And so I began to recognize the form of discrimination that was articulated in my household, which basically was homologous with the kind of racism that was typical in the country as a whole.
Dehors! Joanna! Joanna, sors!
And so I began as an engineering student at Tufts. But over time, I joined a fraternity, and I noticed that most of the fraternities on campus had discrimination clauses that would not take black students into them. And so I became active in the civil rights movement. Because of my interest in the race issue and a philosophy course and a political theory course that I liked, I decided to go to graduate school in political science rather than to become an engineer and work for my father, who sold construction equipment, basically. And I'm going to take a break here before I go back to the conceptual stuff. And so I've become much more of a humanities person. But in the process, I've never lost my interest in the philosophy of method. And so my latest book, which has influenced a lot of the teaching that I've done here in Rio, is on so-called transdisciplinary method. But it's important to recognize that when one talks about transdisciplinary method, one is not simply trying to articulate method together and simply build them as though they belong together. I like the concept that Jacques Rancière uses, which he calls indisciplinarity. Indisciplinarity is the orientation that breaks the boundaries of disciplines rather than blending them together. And so when I talk about transdisciplinary method, I'm talking about ways of thinking that disrupt the ordinary protocols of knowledge practices, as it were, okay? One of the things I've begun doing in recent years is teaching courses on writing. And I was asked the other day when I was in Porto Alegre, how is it that I have time to do so much writing? And the argument I made was it's not a matter of time, it's a matter of preparation. One of the things that allows me basically to keep writing is the fact that I have something to write about. And what makes it possible to write about something is basically consuming lots of things, reading a lot, watching films, paying attention to everyday life, accumulating experiences and literatures and genres so that when you have an idea that you want to work on, you have material to begin to illustrate it, basically.
Why are films interesting? Why they
Yeah,
have-
right, yeah. Yeah, another experience that I have by readers of my essays that I send to social science journals is they'll say something like, this is just about a movie, which they would never say that this is just about a book. In a movie, a film is much more complicated than a book because not only does it have discourse, it has color, it has mood, it has music, it has editing in interesting ways. In other words, a cinematic text is much more powerful than a literary text because of all of the different aspects of meaning making that it assembles, as it were.
Srpskoj deci nanese zlo, ali Srbin on ne da to. Ne da Srbin ni ime ni čast, zna se gde će srpsko dete rast.
Some years ago, it finally dawned on me that I was teaching in Hawaii. When I got out of graduate school, I was building a social science persona, and I assumed that the currency of that social science persona could be spent irrespective of the nature of the place. But there's something special about Hawaii. There's a large indigenous population. And one of the things I began to notice was that the indigenous subject is not articulated well in the discourses of political science. And so I decided to do something about that and write something. At the same time, I wanted to teach something about it, and I noticed that there was no course in the curriculum that would allow me to do it. However, one of my colleagues had invented a course called Methods and Nations, by which he meant the particular quantitative methods one could use to study nations. But I decided that basically you could use the same title and totally re-inflect it to mean something entirely different, and that is the way in which the method of a nation is the reproduction of itself. And so I decided to write something about what I ended up calling cultural governance, the way in which nations basically reproduce itself by managing the arts, landscape painting, theater, music, a whole variety of ways basically in which the nation reproduces itself through the governance of cultural institutions. And to contrast that with a variety of forms of cultural practice that resist the governance of the state. So for example, I paid a lot of attention to Hawaiian rap music and to Hawaiian hymns, which although not obvious to the average Euro population of Hawaii, were forms of resistance that were going on. And so my book, Methods and Nations, is a intervention in the way in which political science has articulated the study of the nation state. And so what I'm interested in, on the one hand, is how the state mobilizes the arts. For example, in the French case, they created the Grand Opera, which the French cultural governor basically said that the purpose of Grand Opera is to invite the people into the nation, basically. Right? So it's an attempt to create Frenchness. And in some of my other work, I've been interested in the way in which the Hong Kong crime story creates Chineseness, or the way in which the architecture of the New Berlin created a new kind of Germanness, as it were. And so what cultural governance is about is collective identity creation. And sometimes it's state-oriented identity creation, sometimes it's an alternative form of identity.
Meu coração faz tica, tica, bum, tica. E vem a saudade da Bahia, onde o samba tem canjica também numa batucada. Tica, bum, 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 bum. É brasileiro, tica, tica, bum, tica. Com pandeiro fazendo tica, bum, tica. E para terminar, vocês devem cantar tica, tica, bum, tica, tica, bum, tica, tica, bum, tica, tica, bum, tica.
My friends, I extend felicitations to our South American relations. May we never leave behind us all the common ties that bind us.
Influenced a lot by the work of Jacques Rancière, after my study of Methods and Nations, I began to pay attention to the dynamics of subjectification. And that is the way in which people make of themselves a political subject when the positions that have been allocated to them are non-political, as it were. And one of the best places to find that is basically paying attention to film, literature, music, a whole variety of the arts, basically, which create challenging forms of subjectivity, which violate the pattern of places that are allowed for different kinds of subjects, that basically delegitimate the ordinary traditional structure of identity that is dominated by the dominant institutions, the state, official culture, and so forth.
De qualquer maneira, te dou meu boteco, te dou meu barraco, que tenho no morro de Mangueira. Comigo não há embaraço, vem que eu te faço meu amor. A rainha da escola de samba, que te...
So I paid a lot of attention to the way in which Jewish Americans created the Broadway musical, the way African Americans created the blues and jazz tradition, basically the way in which people engaged in acts of subjectification to make a place for themselves. When an indigenous subject expresses itself, it's a political act no matter what that indigenous subject is saying, right? Because the ordinary assumption about indigenous subjects is that they're to be understood simply as a working life, not as a speaking life. And the very fact that they speak becomes a political act, because what they're doing is they're creating a form of subjectivity that's not the place that's been allocated to them. Jacques Rancière uses the concept in his study of workers who write. It's a book called The Nuit du Prolétaire, the Nights of the Proletariat. And that is people who, as in his words, take the time that they have not to write something. And he points out it doesn't matter what they're writing, the very fact that they're writing is the political act, because it's a disruption of the subjective place that's been allocated to them. And so the indigenous people are political not simply because they're walking around protesting their situation, but because they're beginning to speak. They're articulating who they are, how they understand themselves, what their world is about.
It doesn't matter who's wrong or right. Just beat it, beat it. Just beat it, beat it, beat it, beat it. No one wants to be defeated. Showing how funky strong is a fighter. It doesn't matter who's wrong or right. Just beat it, beat it. Just beat it, beat it. You're out to get you better, live all you can. Don't wanna be a boy, you wanna be a man. You wanna stay
Viva buscando a madrugada.
Matang itu Adam itu jerok.
Adam itu pajak kita.
Adam itu.
Mike di kuali.
Okay. Some years ago, while reading Foucault's text on the history of sexuality, there's a line that had a big impact on me, how important it is to cut off the head of the king. And so rather than focusing on official political culture, I've become more and more concerned with the people who lead what I would call precarious lives. And the concept of precarity finds itself migrating into some of my work. And I've found that the best way to understand precarious lives is looking at film and literature. And so, for example, over time, on more than one occasion, I've done readings of the film Dirty Pretty Things, where the primary aesthetic subjects are precarious immigrants who don't have legal right to work and must constantly hide what they're doing in the UK. And so in the Dirty Pretty Things, one of the most striking kinds of juxtapositions one sees is the precarious lives of people who work illegally in London hotels and the lives of people who are tourists who enjoy the city in a leisurely way with no threat whatsoever. And so one of the kinds of concepts that I found increasingly important is the difference between what one could call macro politics, and that's policy making by official institutions, and what one calls micro politics, and that is the experience of people who try to cope with their world and against a whole variety of forms of pressure and inhibition that make it a struggle to cope. And so the macro versus the micro political. And in a whole variety of different kinds of texts, one can find wonderful material on that. For example, one of my former students and I, Sam Opondo, have recently finished an essay on migrant domestic workers. And one of the readings we do is a film by the very first African director who did a film in Africa, Ousmane Sembene. The film is called Black Girl, and it's about a young woman who ends up working for a French family, and she's so abused she commits suicide. But in the process, basically, one can understand how the colonial experience isn't over. It's no longer France dominating Senegal, it's the French family dominating the domestic servant. And so colonialism has migrated basically from the level of the state to the level of the household. And the household is very important. I'm reminded, among other things, by a wonderful line about the work of Franz Kafka by Roberto Calasso in a book called K. He says, for Kafka, a room can be as charged as a continent. The concept of strategy and tactics helps us to understand those people who live fairly precarious lives, who live on the periphery, who are liminars, people who don't have control of various forms of territory. As Michel de Certeau puts it, strategies are the privilege of people who control space. Tactics are the actions of people who control no space, so they have to make use of time. So, for example, in the story, The Embassy of Cambodia, the character Fatou notices that something that the family doesn't, and namely that there are free passes to use the swimming pool in a drawer in the hallway. Okay? And so she makes use of the moment when the family on Mondays is not in the household. She goes into the drawer, she gets the free passes, and she's able to enjoy the kind of leisure that privileged people enjoy, not because she controls the household or any kind of space, but she makes use of the moment. She works in time rather than in space. Okay, I want to say something about the methodological peculiarities in my war crimes book, which was inspired primarily by a novel by Matthias Enard about a character named Mirkovic, who was a former Croatian militiaman who ends up taking a trove of archives to the Vatican about atrocities that have taken place in the Mediterranean area. And one of the things that really struck me is that after talking about the war crimes trial of his former commander Blaskic, Mirkovic begins to talk about some people he observes on a train who are arms traders. Right? And so I began to think about clashing cartographies, the map of peacekeeping, the map of justice trials, and the map of arms trading, all of which are disjunctive. They're clashing cartographies. And what the conditions of possibility for some of the atrocities that takes place are the fact that the juridical map has voids in it. There are dead zones, very much like the cell phone map, where people can get away with things that they wouldn't be able to get away with in other places. And so my book on war crimes deals, among other things, with cartographic intersections that are conditions of possibility for justice, war crimes, and atrocity.
No, I'm afraid the kitchen is closed for midnight. I'm sorry. Good night.
All right. Among the stories that I've been working with lately is a series of stories by a Hungarian writer called Thomas Debosy. And one of them is about a character who's wearing, a man who's wearing lots of makeup. And it turns out that everything in this man's life has been a matter of basically of one kind of performance versus another.
Pucaj sebi u nogu. Rani se kroz meso.
Šta ti?
Ne znam. Ne ide na liniju, preživi.
Biće sve u redu, je? Smijet ćemo se ovome, vjeruj mi.
Rat je prelazni period od čovjeka do vojnika. Ako ne nosiš suknju, onda nosiš pušku. Ja sam dobio prvo, a Milan drugo. Čuvaj se.
Čuvat ću se, Bože. Čuvaj se ti.
I ran svo meso ne boli.
Pamet mlada.
Brže, brže! Emilio, stupi! Brže! Mirno!
Braćo, 500 godina! 5 vjekova nas je tuska!
Dosta smijeha!
Čitav svijet je protiv Srba. I Vatikan, i Meka, Washington, i Berlin, Istanbul.
And basically throughout his life he's been being in a situation of having to invent himself because there are various forms of authority that are delegitimating how he wants to feel, how he wants to be, who he wants to connect with, as it were. Yeah. And so what Holo indicates is not the structure of fault lines, but the fact that we're always wearing masks of one sort or another. And the question is, when we adopt one kind of mask, to what extent are we serving as relays for structure of power and authority, or to what extent are we evading them? Right? And so the pattern of revealing and concealing that the masks are about basically tell us something about the extent to which one is being either complicit or resistant to structures of power and authority. There's a paradigmatic moment that reminds me of this. Rue Paul, who's a female interpreter, a female impersonator, an African-American man who dresses as a very sexy woman. And at one point, he's on television being interviewed by Bryant Gumbel, a typical moderator. And Bryant says, "Rue, what is it like to be in costume all the time?" And Rue Paul says to Bryant, "Bryant, do you look like that when you get out of the shower?" And so what I did after I read Duboisi's story, The Beautician, I paid a lot of attention to Hungarian texts. The films of Béla Tarr, the extraordinary set of texts that were assembled by Peter Forjaks, who found home movies from about 3 or 4 decades of Hungarian experience and put together what constitutes Hungarian private life during the pre-communist and post-communist periods. And what he does is he juxtaposes newsreels with the various home movies, as it were. And so I began to experience Hungary during the dynamic with which the particular story begins to take place. And I do that with lots of things. When I want to write something about LA as a city, I watch the films of LA. I look at the novels that people write. I look at the television coverage. I look at LA Weekly, a whole variety of things that constitute the city in a whole variety of different genres. Okay, I want to follow up some of my remarks about masks that take place in the story by Thomas Duboisi with a reflection on a film done by a Bosnian named Ahmed Imamovic. As I started my war crimes book, I had already been very interested in the writings of exilic Bosnians, because out of the Balkans War there were 2 streams. One, war crimes perpetrators who ended up in The Hague, and the other is exilic Bosnians who left the country. And I've paid a lot of attention to their literature and to their films. And Imamovic's film Go West is extraordinary because it's about a couple, a Bosnian cello player and a Serbian militiaman who are a gay couple. And because the cello player is being imperiled because as the Serbs take over all of the roads, they're pulling people's pants down, and if they discover a circumcised person, they kill him. And so the Serbian militiaman disguises his lover as a woman and brings him up to his Serbian enclave. And there's a dramatic difference in the venues because the film opens in a concert hall where you could be in almost any Western city. The West is always already in the East in this particular experience. But once you get into the Serbian enclave, it becomes very much the East again. And it becomes clear to the lovers that their only chance for survival is to go west. And so the disguise becomes a necessary form of subterfuge for them to survive. And it basically tells us a lot about the East-West traffic that goes around as a result of the forms of identity difference relationships that drive the kinds of hostility that are going on in the Balkans War, as it were. And so the traffic between east and west constitutes basically the kinds of flows that I pay attention to try to understand the implications of what war is about. What kinds of bodies are involved, what kinds of movements are imposed on them, what are the consequences basically of who can leave and who can't. One of the things that I talk about frequently is that the grammar of analysis is very important. And it's not so much that we operate in the world, it's rather important to turn the concept of world into a verb. We world. The question is, how do we impose things on the world such that the world becomes available to us? And the way Heidegger finally puts it is, how is it that we world? And so it's not who we are, but how we are situated in the world such that our practices make the world the way that it is.
Caminhando contra o vento, sem lenço, sem documento, no sol de quase dezembro, eu vou. O sol se reparte em crimes, espaçonaves, guerrilhas, encardinadas bonitas, eu vou. Em caras de presidentes, em grandes beijos de amor, em dentes, pernas, bandeiras, Bomba e Brigitte Bardot. O sol nas bancas de revista me enche de alegria e preguiça. Quem lê tanta notícia? Eu vou por entre fotos e nomes, os olhos cheios de cores, o peito cheio de amores vãos. Eu vou, por que não, por que não? Ela pensa em casamento e eu nunca mais fui à escola, sem lenço, sem documento. Eu vou. Eu tomo uma Coca-Cola, ela pensa em casamento e uma canção me consola. Eu vou por entre fotos e nomes, sem livros e sem fuzil, sem fome, sem telefone, no coração do Brasil. Ela nem sabe, até pensei em cantar na televisão. O sol é tão bonito. Eu vou sem lenço, sem documento, nada no bolso ou nas mãos. Eu quero seguir vivendo.